Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our second Perspectives by Air Insight. I'm Fiona Mackay-Reddy, and online with me we have Ernie Ivey and Addison Shonland, the founders of Air Insight. I want to say a huge welcome to all of our newcomers and a big thank you to everybody who's returning. We started this because we wanted to create a sense of community and an opportunity for us all to share what we know. So we really appreciate you wanting to be a part of it. So a few logistics before we get started. So I've put everybody on mute to avoid any background noise. And we are going to be sharing slides. So if you're on the phone, you might want to jump to your laptop. We don't share the slides after the video briefing, but what we do is we upload the video to the subscription section of Air Insight. So if you want to know more about that, head over to airinsight.com. And if you want a good view of the slides and the people who are speaking, we recommend that you also alter your screen to go into gallery view. There's going to be an opportunity for people to ask questions towards the end of the webinar. So as those thoughts come up during people's presentations, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see the opportunity to hit the chat bar. So, feel free to put any questions in that chat bar, and then I will summarize at the end, and then we can open up to any extra questions. So for those of you that are new, this is about creating a sense of community, and we're here to share our perspective on current market events. So Air Insight, we don't have advertising on our website, so we've got a very unique, independent view of what's going on in the marketplace. Totally independent, and over 100 years of experience between us. So you get the benefit from that knowledge. So each week we're going to be looking at the impact on airlines and aerospace manufacturers. Have chance for Q&A. And the other thing I wanted to mention today is for future webinars, we've just, based on feedback we've received so far, what we're going to do is we're going to alternate each week. We've got quite a diverse audience. We've got everything from small manufacturers to forecasters, to people at large OEMs, to people in the media business. So we want to make sure we hit everybody's needs. So every other week there will be a broad market update. And then in the sessions in between, we're going to do a deep dive into a specific topic. So next week, we'll be doing a deep dive into rate realignment. Later in the month, revised market forecast. But if you have ideas of deep dive topics that you would love to hear from, or perhaps you're an expert on and you want to share, just reach out to me and let me know, because we want to make sure that we're designing this for you. Okay, so now to dive into today's presentation. So Ernie's first going to give us a brief overview of what we're seeing in the world of coronavirus and how that's impacting aerospace in different regions. Then Addison is going to give us a roundup of the airlines and what we might see in terms of fleet retirements and some decisions that those airlines might take in the coming weeks. And then I'm going to dive in and do the OEM roundup, and then we will open up to questions. So over to you, Ernie.
Thank you, Fiona, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ernie Ivey, president of Air Insight Group. Today, I'd like to quickly update where we are with the latest statistics on coronavirus and traffic as a result of that before turning things over to my colleagues to talk about the impacts on our industry. There's the first slide. This slide and the next are a bit disconcerting, but they show comparable progression of the disease in several countries. But today isn't all doom and gloom, as there are pockets of hope. But in this slide, the US and the European Union appear to be following a much sharper climb than China and South Korea in terms of the number of cases. So we haven't spread that curve as much as perhaps we'd like to. The good news is it could produce a narrower distribution at the top, and we could have an equally sharp come down in rates, given the fact that we've got a slightly higher rate of people contracting the disease. So hopefully this will result in a curve that comes down quicker and is a little more omega shaped than the one that's shown on this chart. May I have the next slide, please? This chart shows the rate of growth in the disease over the last few weeks. The time frame for this is, I think, 75 days since the first cases in China were reported, and we've only been 32 days or so since the first cases in the U.S. were reported. So this isn't that large a time frame, but nonetheless, we're showing exponential rates of growth still in the U.S., primarily New York, New Orleans, and here in Detroit, where I am. Hopefully our efforts in staying home can move the curve a little bit further out to the right. But these two slides don't look that great. May you have the next slide, please. This slide shows a running analysis of flights in China, and it's I think a 7-day moving average. What we're showing here is domestic, international, and regional flights within China. And the domestic flights have leveled off at about 60% of prior capacity. It was a little dip last week, and this goes through yesterday, but pretty stable. Flights to Wuhan have resumed this week. Hubei province is reopening, so I think we've got some things going. Internationally, China has basically shut its airspace down to 1 flight per week for international flights per country. So we've got a weakness on the international side that will continue for some time. May I have the next slide, please? China is still our baseline. We've got some mixed news in China. As we can see, the flights in China have stabilized and Wuhan has reopened, but there's some interesting reports coming out of Wuhan as well. The first, by a Spanish investigative journalist, suggests the death toll was much higher, based on orders for cremation urns from 7 Wuhan funeral homes, which dwarf the total reported death tolls in the area. The second is a report indicating that China lost 21 million cell phone subscribers in March. Even if 1% of those were a result of the coronavirus, it would indicate that the Chinese government has been a little less than forthcoming regarding the virus. The other disturbing fact was the new cases rose from 19 on Saturday in China to 32 on Sunday, indicating that we're not quite finished with the virus, although some of those they claim were people coming in from overseas. Domestic flights have stabilized, and this data from OAG, thanks to our friends at Kappa, shows that we've had an uptick in terms of the scheduled flights. It's planned to go a little further, but then settle back down at a lower rate. May I have the next slide, please? This one shows South Korea. And what we've seen in South Korea is the start of a V-shaped recovery in 2020. The flights go down and then return back up, and are scheduled to go back to almost normal levels within the next month or so. So South Korea is showing nearly full schedules projected for later this year for domestic operations, which is primarily to Jibu. May I have the next slide, please? Vietnam is showing an even sharper V-shaped recovery as flights have resumed with a sharp rebound in the last week. They're headed upward in terms of the schedule, and the schedule actually shows growth coming later this year in Vietnam. So if the number of flights planned can go ahead as planned and the airlines can get enough passengers, it looks like the plans are to be back to normal by July for Vietnam. So there are several pockets of hope out there. Looking, may I have the next slide? Looking globally, however, this slide dramatically illustrates the year-to-year drop-off in air travel. Flight Radar 24 does an interesting job in tracking flights. We can see this moving average line in the blue for this year. And you can also see a slight uptick in some of the flights during the last week, which is probably going to for the Asian flights. But the new schedule has come out, and the airlines are eliminating 11.1 million new seats in the new schedule, which starts this week. United has reduced capacity 41%. Delta and American are each down about 39% with the new schedules. So it's not good news in the short term, and the second quarter looks like it'll be a washout for traffic in the US. Looking for good news, both Delta and United have said if you're an elite frequent flyer, they'll extend your benefits to next year as well. So you don't have to earn the status this year, which most people won't be able to do. May I have the next slide? Finally, passengers have almost disappeared in the US, and crews and staff are now likely the largest blocks of folks being screened. This latest data from the TSA screening levels are now at about 4.5% of what they were a year ago. So we're at a very low level of screening traffic at the airport, which indicates we're at a very low level of passenger traffic. Load factors have dropped to almost nothing. And there was a story I was reading about a woman who went to see her very ill mother and was the only person on the flight both directions last week. So lots of flights are flying empty. We're in the midst of a bloodbath for the industry short term, and I'll turn to my colleague Addison Shanlin to illustrate some fleet data and how this crisis impacts a number of older aircraft that have been grounded and may never return to the skies once this crisis abates. I think you'll find his analytics and tools quite interesting. Addison, over to you.
Thank you, Ernie. Let me just share my screen here with you. I want to echo, of course, the welcome from my colleagues. For those of you back for a second week, that's very, very encouraging. And for those of you on your first visit, we hope that you enjoy what we have to share with you. What I have on the first slide is the active fleets at the end of 2019, which must feel for most of us now like a decade ago, but it's basically 60 days. Somewhere around 60 days ago, 92% of the world's airline, this is airline passenger fleet, 92% of the fleet was active in service doing its thing. You'll see pockets of red here, little ones, but that's in West Africa, onesies and twosies. Essentially, we were doing great as an industry. Now, I have more data here than I have time, and I don't want to get into trouble with my colleagues, so I'm going to jump to the critical one. And let's start off with this one here. Lufthansa, 30 minutes ago, announced the following. 7 340-600s, plus 3 340-300s, 6 380s, 5 747-400s, and 21 320s are going to be retired. Now, in this particular chart, what you're seeing here is the 747s that are leased, and this is the own fleet and the leased fleet. And if it's in red, it's over 20 years old, which means it's prime time for a one-way ticket to the breaker's yard. In this chart, we have a scheme to try and give you an idea of how the fleet is laid out. So you can see how much, for example, how many units are the 320 and where everybody else is. So for Lufthansa, these are going to be gone. A bunch of the 320s are going to be gone. Those will be gone. These are still flying for Austrian. They'll probably be gone shortly. So what we have in this chart was anything in the top left-hand corner is prime target to go, particularly at this row here at the 20-year mark. Now, I wanted to show you some interesting things here. So IAG, British Airways, Vueling, and Iberia, you can see here, 32 747-400s, nearly 23 years old. Top left-hand corner, you can see that's where they are. They also have a few approaching the 20-year mark. When you look at this, the natural thing to say is, this is it's terrible, airplanes are being parked, but actually it's not necessarily the case. It could be a fabulous opportunity. And let me give you some other examples. Let's look at American. Lots of red. Up here in the corner, from 20, you can see the 75s and the 76s, which we believe are parked, are going to stay parked. Let's take a look at Delta, another candidate for several plane models. Look at this. Those are the old legacy 320s from Northwest. These airplanes probably will go away and not come back. Another candidate. Look at United. Lots of planes in the top left-hand corner. Here's a bit of a sort of being the salmon swimming upstream. What happens if the airlines take this opportunity to totally clean out their fleets? Get rid of the old equipment that is expensive to maintain, that's expensive to operate, that has high fuel burn. You're getting a once in a lifetime opportunity. Quote Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste. This is a fantastic time for someone, let's say like British Airways, or in the case of United, get rid of the old stuff, so to speak, and give yourself time over the next 24, maybe a bit longer for the wide bodies. Give yourself time to readjust your fleet. So for example, at British Airways, where you've got these 747s, the perfect replacement for that airplane is actually the 350, 1000. If you were British Airways, if you were the fleet manager at British Airways, this would be a good time to go to Airbus and say, look, 24 months at the earliest, but probably a little later than that, we would like to be taking some 1000s because we believe the capacity is going to be needed because the traffic will come back. Heathrow is going to stay popular. British Airways is going to stay in business. A lot of other airlines are not necessarily going to stay in business, but what we see here is that each airline has its own story. So for example, United is going to get some 321s to replace the 757s. So each airline has its own particular story, but on the big picture scheme, it's probably time for a lot of these airlines to take this opportunity, use this crisis effectively. I want to show you my final slide here. On the left, you see the names of the major airlines. These are airlines with 200 airplanes or more. And the OEMs across the top. Wherever you see a red number, like this one at Air Canada, their Airbus fleet is nearly 20 years old, prime time. By the way, just yesterday, Air Canada retired the original 320 they took delivery of. So there's an example. Lufthansa was another example here, where they are taking the opportunity to clean out their fleet, take this opportunity to adjust to the new reality. Because at the end of this, when we come out of this, if you have adjusted your fleet, you will be greener, cleaner, quieter, and in many parts of the world, certainly outside the United States, that is a very admirable and desirable goal from a political point of view. That's the end of my presentation today, so I'm going to hand it back to Fiona. Thank you.
Fiona, you can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted, Fiona.
I'm off. Sorry. Thanks for that. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Addison. I think when we get into the Q&A section, people might want to dive into a little bit more of that data because it's pretty interesting. So today I am going to give an OEM roundup. As most of you know, I'm new to this team, so I am still earning my wings. So if Ernie and Addison want to jump in with any extra thoughts on the OEMs, that is most welcome. So the current crisis is actually effectively ending the 16-year boom that we've seen in orders. We're expecting that when we come out of this, rather than a 7-year backlog, there's going to be a 3.5 to 4-year backlog. We're seeing a huge surge in requests for delays and cancellations. In fact, 80% of the airlines are now requesting them. So there's going to be a big impact on the OEMs. However, not all OEMs are going to be hurt equally. So the extent to which your business may be affected will depend on who you serve and what the recovery looks like for those OEMs. So when we took a look at each of the OEMs, there's 3 main things that we looked at. We looked at the desirability of the product mix, because the flexibility of the products will, and the current status, with any modifications or any regulatory issues, will affect the rate at which they come back into the market. We also looked at the cash position of the business, and because that will impact what they're able to do with their customers and their suppliers, and the business model. How well balanced is it? And this is definitely a big one for the engine manufacturers because a lot of their income is looking at the aftermarket. So let's dive into Boeing first. As most of you are aware, they've extended the Seattle area shutdown, which is having a big impact on those suppliers that are primarily supplying to Boeing. It's now indefinite. And in addition, they've extended the shutdown to Boeing, South Carolina. And as a result, 30,000 operational staff have been ordered to take vacation time or sick time or apply for unemployment. And they've also begun offering voluntary separations. From a financial standpoint, Boeing was already challenged financially due to the grounding of the MAX. It's said that they've got 15 billion cash on hand, but lots of people are speculating that that is not enough. So right now, while Boeing is resisting government ownership with the 60 billion industry bailout, they're going to be in for some tough decisions. And the longer that the MAX is delayed, the more that is going to impact their position. And that could be further slowed now because the US put 15% tariffs on Airbus deliveries into the USA. So we expect there may be some political response from EASA. And obviously, you know, coronavirus with people being out of the office, that's going to delay recertification efforts. They're seeing lots of cancellations. So Air Canada cancelled a few weeks back. Leasing giant Avalon cancelled 75 MAXs last week. But right now, we have not got new forecasts from Boeing. We think that there's going to potentially be a lot more cancellations for those that have ordered the MAX because due to those delays, a lot of customers can actually cancel with no penalties. So that's quite significant. As for the other models, so 787 is announced to drop to 10 per month, but we are hearing that it could go as low as 6 per month. But overall, the supply chain has not yet been fully communicated to in terms of the portfolio, but our estimates suggest that by 2024, Boeing will have resumed production rates that are about the equivalent of 65% of the formerly projected rates for 2021. So that means there's a long road ahead for Boeing, and it puts the NMA in question. Furthermore, their position, you know, could be impacted by their acquisition of Embraer, and so that may be something that stays on hold for some time. Do you have anything to add, Ernie or Addison? Okay, I will move on to Airbus. So Airbus has right now has been less affected by the coronavirus. They have had a few employees test positive, but obviously with them not being located in one of the hotspots, they've been less affected than Boeing. The plant in Alabama is now closed, but everything else is open. And one thing that's particularly interesting is the Tianjin plant. It's now at full capacity with China taking deliveries of the A320s. There's nothing been announced yet in terms of layoffs, but we believe it's only a matter of time before we start to hear something from Airbus. From a cash perspective, they're in a stronger cash position than some of their competitors. They have 30 billion euro to burn through as they've applied for credit facilities, cancelled dividends, and reduced operational costs. They're very confident that they're not going to need a government bailout. We believe that Airbus is actually relatively well positioned to weather the storm. The A220 is doing well, the A321 is doing well, the A350. The A220 and the A321 are, likely to be, the first airplanes to be, re-entering the market post-coronavirus. The business model is very balanced, so we believe that Airbus is actually well positioned to weather this. So right now, the current announcements are that the A320 is going to be down to 36 per month in 2021. And so they're not likely to get back to the highs of 65 a month until more like 2027, 2028. And the A330neos are down to 2 per month. A350 is down to 5 per month. And we haven't heard yet on the A220, but we're expecting there to be 10 to 12 per month. And we fully expect Delta to take their deliveries from Mobile. So overall, we're expecting a faster bounce back for Airbus. Our estimates suggest that by 2024, Airbus will have resumed production rates that total 88% of their formerly projected rates for 2021. So moving on to Embraer. They've faced challenges as the merger with Boeing has been underway. And the E2 sales have been relatively weak, but the decline in oil prices might actually help with the desirability of the E175. But it's a difficult one to predict because everything associated with the order book was up in the air due to their acquisition, which is now likely to be delayed. So moving across to the engine manufacturers, Rolls-Royce production rates are expected to be down significantly, and there's talk of furloughing up to 50% of their shop floor workers. And they've been taking significant actions. They've cut the salary of their global workforce by 10%, and the executive team's pay this year will be reduced by 20%. And they have been taking significant steps to secure their cash position. So they've taken a lot of measures to bolster liquidity. So right now they've got a current gross cash balance of $2.5 billion. So that is relatively positive news for their suppliers and customers. Overall, we are expecting Rolls-Royce to be hit worse than GE because they mostly power wide bodies, and those will be the fleets that return to service, later. And last month, the engine flying hours were down by 50%, and the vast majority of new engine sales come with total care contracts. So it's going to be a tough road ahead for Rolls-Royce, but they're positioning themselves to weather it. Moving on to GE, there's a temporary reduction in engine assembly and some of their component manufacturing. They too are planning on furloughing 50% of their manufacturing staff and have cut 10% of their US workforce. They're also taking measures to bolster liquidity, but nothing's been announced yet, unlike their European counterparts. Overall, between GE and their partnership with CFM, over 2/3 of the Boeing and Airbus fleets are actually powered by GE. So that places them in a good position with the dominance in the narrow body market. So they're likely to fare better than Rolls-Royce in the recovery, but their MAX dependency could cause some issues for them. And several of the CFM suppliers are also in Europe, so that could have an impact on the recovery. Finally, taking a look at Pratt Whitney, now that they've resolved the issues with GTF and their position with Airbus, we think that there's a relatively smooth path ahead for Pratt Whitney. There will be some impact on the deliveries due to Airbus's reduced production, but they're well positioned. They've got exclusivity with the A220, E2 jets, and the MRJ. So we predict positive things ahead for them. Still watching closely what's going to happen post-merger with Raytheon. But overall, it's a relatively good picture for them, although like most of the other major OEMs, their parent company, Collins Aerospace, has suspended the non-essential spending and the hiring freeze, and has deferred bonuses as well. So in summary, very mixed bag for each of the OEMs. Our advice to you would be to take a look at how your portfolio is aligned across these different OEMs and to adjust accordingly. So do you have anything to add to that, Addison and Ernie?
No, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Okay.
I think you did a nice job with that.
Thank you. Okay, so moving over to our questions. So John Walton would like to know, do we have any hard data on Chinese load factor at this point? With a strong lockdown, it might be a different path forward to elsewhere in the world.
No, I don't have hard data on Chinese load factors at this point. It's something that I'll look for and see if we can update for next week.
Okay, so there seems to be a lot of conversation back and forth in the group chat, which is excellent. I'm going to take everybody off mute now, so that if people want to ask additional questions, they are able to do so.
Or continue to use the chat.
Hi Fiona, it's Mick.
Hi Mick.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. Just so
Yeah.
everybody knows, Mick is my former boss.
Over the pond. No, thank you for this. Very interesting. When you spoke about the Airbus and Boeing plants, which were open and closed, were you referring to US plants only or worldwide?
Worldwide.
Worldwide. Thank you.
We have a very quiet audience today. Okay, so question from Mark. So Mark asks, do we still anticipate that regional jets are most likely to be among the first to see a large-scale return to service because of load flexibility? I would hand that one over to Addison.
Yes, I think that we stick with that view, and I'll tell you, about 70%, 72% of the world's regional jets fly in the US. So anything that happens in the regional jet business is typically driven by the US. And if we look at regional jets here, that industry is governed by that horrible thing or that good thing, depending on where you are, called scope clause. Just as we spoke about the adjustment to fleets because of the crisis, I was speaking to somebody just yesterday about this. This might be a great time to reconsider what scope clause is going to look like coming out of this. Because if we start with regional jets, okay, great, we get those flying first, but several airlines have ratios. You can only fly so many regional jets if the mainline fleet is so big. There's an X factor. Well, what happens if you're not flying the big jets and you need to fly all the regionals? How do the pilots who are running the scope clause at the mainline going to deal with it? It may be that the sheer circumstance breaks scope clause as we know it to allow more flexibility, which is in essence the bigger airplanes like the E2 and the forthcoming Mitsubishi jet, but particularly the E2175. But certainly, to go back to your original question, yes, regional jet is the start of the regional jets and turboprops will probably be the start of the recovery.
You also, Addison, see the smaller aircraft like A220 being a part of the recovery?
Right. Now, it's interesting. American parked their E190s. Delta is still flying their 220s. The general consensus that I'm coming across is that it's easier to sell a turboprop and a regional jet and maybe a 100-seater because the load factors are going to be so low to start off with, and those are the lowest cost, lowest risk airplanes to sell capacity. You're not going to necessarily sell 162 seats on a 737 or a 320 that easily, obviously not even on a 777 until international markets open up. So for example, China is an example where domestic flying is allowed, international flying is not allowed because they don't want any more virus stuff coming in. So there's this protectionist wall occurring in China, and we suspect that that's going to happen as other countries start to open up. So let's say Canada and the US will come up to some kind of a joint arrangement of they will allow flying between them. And then they will open across the Pacific and the South Atlantic and the North Atlantic gradually. But to come back to the original, yes, I think we start off with regional airlines.
And so our next question is from Jim. It says, what type of aircraft is China using to begin opening services?
320s and 737s. If you go to Flight Radar 24, you can actually see a live map of what's going on. And if you have an account, you can actually filter to put identifiers on the little pictures you see of each airplane. And you'll see it's generally narrow bodies. They're also trying to recover. And so I don't want to say that China is necessarily an exact model for us. It's a clue, but it's not an exact model because certainly in the North American situation and in the European situation, you have much more mature air travel markets which could accelerate quicker. China has this huge high-speed rail business. Maybe that's slowing down the recovery of the airlines as well. And then it is separation. How long do we have the separation? Because as we all know, flying guarantees that you're not going to be able to separate from anybody, even by as much as 6 inches.
Well, with the current load factors, you might be able to get a lot more than 6 inches.
That's true.
So from Jim Bowden, so any insight into FedEx, UPS, and Amazon Air cargo loads?
No, we were focused on passengers today.
So perhaps that could be a topic for a future deep dive, taking a look at the cargo market.
It really could be, because the retirement of some of the older wide bodies will give an opportunity for cargo conversions as well, as cargo continues to need additional lift, and cargo continues to grow with international trade, and will come back. We've certainly seen a number of flights. Even the New England Patriots use their airplane to bring over medical masks from China. So there's a need for cargo during the emergency, and there'll probably be a need for cargo to resupply the supply chain for all sorts of goods once we're out of the crisis. So air cargo is going to be essential, and that may be a destination for some of the planes that go into the desert into cargo conversions.
So our next question is from Carlos Almeida. How do you see the 777X going forward?
This one I see as being a bit difficult for Boeing right now. Large wide bodies are not in great demand. That particular airplane is focused on the Middle East 3 are the big customers for that airplane, and they're all essentially grounded at this point. So we've got a situation where we've got players that don't need the aircraft and may want to defer it. Yet it's coming into production, so we've got to get those first airplanes up and get a production rate set to make the line efficient. So looking at anything less than 3 a month is probably not feasible for Boeing. Can the market take 3 a month is the question right now, and that's an open issue. The airplane has been delayed several times. It's being delayed again with the unfortunate fuselage puncture during the last pressurization test. So it's behind schedule and coming into the market at absolutely the wrong time.
Yeah, it's worth noting that in relation to Addison's presentation earlier, in terms of the age of their fleet, most of the Middle Eastern carriers have a very, very young fleet, so they don't have the opportunity to retire airplanes to make space for new ones. Do you want to add to that, Addison?
No, I think that's exactly right. The only, amongst the big players that I listed, only Emirates shows up. And when I look at the Emirates fleet, their Airbus fleet, including the 380s, is 6 years old, and their Boeing fleet is 7.7 years old. I mean, no one's parking airplanes that young unless they have to. And they really have, their flexibility is not anything like those airlines that have old metal that they can get rid of. And you see that, Emirates is trying to start flying again wherever they can. And we've seen Qatar jumping at every opportunity to do these repatriation flights. They've got a modern fleet and they have to figure out some way to use it.
Okay. So our next question is from Jill John. Will the reduced intercontinental traffic help setting up intercontinental transatlantic routes for narrow bodies?
We believe that's probably a yes. And we've already seen this trend begin with the first operations with the 757 back a few years ago on narrow body transatlantic routes. The A321XL and XLR are certainly airplanes that are built just for that purpose. And we expect those will be very popular once they come out. The question is what happens in the interim, and some of the 757s that Addison says may go to the desert might be needed in the interim until the A321, the new models arrive, to continue service on transatlantic routes that just don't have the capacity for a larger wide body. So yes, we see 757s being replaced by A321s and some smaller capacities on transatlantic routes, particularly smaller cities to smaller cities. And as traffic resumes, they may be replaced by wide bodies. But in the interim, that looks like a great way to utilize the flexibility of the 757 for a lot of airlines.
I think if I could add to that, we know that Airbus has taken the 380 plant in Toulouse and turning that into 321. I think that's a pretty clear signal that they are highly confident in the continued demand for that airplane. It can, as we spoke about this last week, it, in the North American context, it can handle domestic services, city to city, because that's the right economics. It can handle transcon and across the water. It is literally like a small 330 in that it can do so much. It's a highly flexible platform, like the 767 was in its day, a highly flexible platform that could do domestic, transcon, and then transatlantic.
Our next question is from Beth DeYoung with Safran. And I think this question would go to Addison based on your comments. Why is this a good time to support the retrofit market if much of the fleet is going to be parked or retired?
Retrofit from what perspective? Cabin? Is that what the question is aimed at? And I would presume, if it's Safran, that it's probably a cabin-related question. I think that probably that's going to be put on hold or on ice or stopped. It doesn't. I don't think it's. Why would you do that right now? Why would you incur that cost? I think that those kinds of projects will all going to be put in the deep freeze.
But if it's a conversion to cargo, that may be a different story.
Correct. Correct.
So another question from Beth that just came in is, if fuel prices stay low and 757 is paid for as an asset, why incur the expense of an A321neo expense?
The answer is primarily maintenance cost as these airplanes get old in the tooth. The 757s are aging rapidly, and you're at the point where after 20 years that you've got a rapid rise in maintenance costs. So what you gain in fuel, you may lose in maintenance, and that's the key issue here, is the cost of repairing these airplanes, as well as the schedule reliability. If you have airplanes that aren't meeting the schedule properly.
I think there's another aspect. Imagine if you were an airline with a good bank rating, and you went to Airbus or to Boeing, and you offered, or the leasing companies, and you said, I'm looking for planes right now. Do you think you wouldn't get a good deal? You'd get the best deal that has been made. It may be the best deal ever. You're going to get them at cost, maybe better than cost. This is a great time to buy if you have the wherewithal, not that you'll take delivery now, but you might structure a deal now for a delivery 18 months from now. And I think that if you look 18 months out, what are you going to buy? Are you going to buy something new that's got all the right, like Ernie says, all the right maintenance costs and the right fuel burn, the economics, the direct operating costs, and of course your capital costs are going to be fabulous right now.
And then question from Sebastian, do you mean that the regional airlines will not be affected?
No, not at all. The regional airlines will be affected just as all of the other airlines have been affected with lower load factors and the situation in which they're probably unprofitable today to many routes. Traffic simply isn't there. But as we come back, the regionals will begin to form the backbone of the of air service right now. Right now, regionals account for, I think, what, 41% of air traffic in the U.S., Addison? something like that, and they operate, I think, 26% of the cities exclusively.
Right.
So there are a lot of places that regional airlines go that no one else does, and it's important to maintain those services for network integrity. So I think regionals will come back, and they'll come back strong. It's just a matter of how much time will it take for the load factors to come up, and financially, can you survive in the interim? We may see some of the 50-seat jets coming out of the desert instead of the 70 or 90-seat jets in the interim to restart some of those routes where the traffic may not be large enough to support the bigger jet.
So, question from Jim Bowden. He noticed that some US majors are no longer releasing their monthly traffic stats. Do you have another source to get more insight sooner on load factors? Because right now, US Department of Transport data lags by 3 months.
Yes, that is a very, very pertinent question. And the short answer is no, we don't have anything. We're waiting for the DOT data. In fact, just before this event started, the D1B, the 10% ticket sample data got published, and I was able to download that, and I have to process that still. But that's through the end of December. The quickest data that we will get on this year from the US DOT will be on time. We have January so far. We should get February within the next week or so. But we all wait to see for March, because that's when the waterfall started. We don't. I don't know of anything more current that we can get our hands on quickly to process to provide you the answer to that question.
Question from Michael Solomonides. Any sign that the Chinese airlines are pursuing the strategy of securing new deals at the attractive market rates?
Not yet, but we expect some activity once international flying resumes in China. And it's probably, given the closures of plants and facilities here, it's probably a bit premature for some of those discussions going on between the parties.
Michael, there's also one has to consider that if they, as Ernie pointed out, they're back to about 60% of their pre-crisis activity, which would, I think, demonstrate that they could easily handle that demand with the current fleet. I think that we can expect to see the Chinese airlines be among the more aggressive when it comes to canceling MAX. That, of course, is not on today's agenda, but there is, I think that in answer to your question, the Chinese airlines probably don't need to worry about added capacity right now or acquiring anything, because that which they have to carry right now, they can handle with what they have, with the current fleets.
And then, not a question, but a point from Fred Sandow. There are a lot of analyst reports right now projecting annual airplane deliveries, broken down by model. And there's a lot of variability in the reports. He would be curious to see our projections. Ernie, I believe that's what you're going to talk about next week.
Yes, that's what I plan to talk about next week. So stay tuned and come back next week, and we'll have our estimates, which will probably be as wrong as anyone else's, but we've got our forecast model by model coming up.
Okay, so do we have any final questions in the chat bar or vocally? Okay. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Oh, looks like we may have a question. So another question from Beth. How do you envision the return to service coming about?
Slowly. We see instead of a V or a U-shaped recovery, somewhat of a checkmark kind of shaped recovery that goes off to the right at a much slower angle than the drop off. So I think it's going to take a while for the industry to get back to where it was. And we see it building from the smaller aircraft to larger as routes rebuild traffic. Airlines will increase capacity in their schedules, but they're going to balance out what they can with the most efficient or lowest cost airplanes that they have and slowly build back up.
I think one of the things that we look for here is rates of people getting infected and rates of fatality. Once those seem to have started to peak and there's a decline, we can then start to talk about, okay, we may have seen bottom in terms of the impact of coronavirus on travel, and then we might start to see some sort of demand come back. But people are going to be fearful of this for a long time. We all see these pictures, these images of people in Asia well before coronavirus, and you go to airports, you'd see them, Asian people always, not always, very often, they have face masks. I think that that's going to be the new normal for a lot of people traveling domestically in the US, intra-regional like Canada and Mexico, and most certainly internationally. The going forward is not going to be like what we've seen before. It's a new normal.
I think a part of that in China is just a reaction to the pollution levels in the air as well. It makes it a little easier to breathe for people with respiratory issues like me.
Question from Sebastian. Are you not afraid of the second wave of COVID in Asia, which has just started? Seems to be more of a U crisis recovery, which is materializing.
Oh, Sebastian, what a question. Of course, we're terrified, I think. There was also a report that China now has a breakout in swine flu. Like, don't we have enough trouble? The second wave of COVID is a big issue. And we hope that lessons learned are going to be have to be learned again. But who knows? Public policy is a strange thing. There are no politicians that have covered themselves in glory as leaders right now. I don't think there's anybody that has come out of this on a public policy standpoint as heroic and effective. Everybody is questioned, and rightly so, I think.
Yeah, we're hoping that the breakout in China is contained and doesn't go into a major second wave. Hopefully, everyone will get enough sunshine and vitamin D during the summer to avoid to build immunity and avoid a second wave in the fall here in the U.S. I think the general healthcare conditions here are a little bit better, and we'll see what happens. But the incidence of smoking in China in the male population and the primarily male victims of the coronavirus may have some correlation there in terms of lung health. And that's something that I think we may be in a little better shape here. At least we hope so.
Final thought on that also, I'm hoping that people in the Southern Hemisphere who are now going into winter are learning as quickly as possible from the mistakes we've made in the Northern Hemisphere. Because if it bounces down there and it doesn't get dealt with very effectively, when we go back into winter in the Northern Hemisphere, it's going to bounce back here. And everybody needs to take whatever lessons learned and apply those lessons quickly so we can stop the spread. And that's all I can say about that.
We're showing Sebastian's next question. We're projecting normal levels back in 2023, 2024.
Define normal.
Back to 2019 levels of traffic and activity. We're looking several years to really come back.
And I want to just point out something, and I don't speak for my necessarily me or Ernie and Fia or like the Air Insight team, but I would like to just speak from a community perspective. when we look out to 2024, we all have to be worrying, where are we going to be by then? What kind of industry will we have? And the impetus behind this event was that we feel that there's no leadership that we can turn to for the guidance to get out of this mess. So really what we needed to do was create a forum where thinking people in this industry could get together once a week and talk about the things that we see, the things that the data points, the stars in the night, if you like, so we can navigate and then do this exchange. It's not just, you know, us presenting to you, but obviously the interaction with the questions and the conversation. We need to, as an industry, come up with ways to get through this as intact as we possibly can, because nobody has a life experience that can teach them how to lead out of this. There is no such person. We are it. And if we don't learn from each other and collaborate, the damage gets worse.
Yeah, there's been some great chat in the chat bar today. Lots of people sharing perspectives. Okay, so collaboration is just as important as competition and makes us all stronger. Thank you for that, Mark.
There's a hug. It's my virtual hug.
Okay, so as we say, collaboration is key here. So if you have requests for future content, if you have future content you would like to share, if you want to be a presenter, if you have some burning questions you'd love to see a whole session on, please let us know. Our team is ready to serve. So if you're looking for an extended session with a member of our team, we've all got different strengths to offer. So just get in touch and we will see what we can do to support you. So thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing many of you again next week.
And to all of you, we wish for the Christian community a happy Easter, for the Jewish community a happy Passover, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.